What if I told you there's a secret so profound, so controversial, that it's been erased from the pages of official history? What if everything you've learned about the origins of religion, about the Bible itself, about the most sacred name in Christianity, is just a distorted version of a much older and more surprising truth? Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover may completely shake everything you believed about Yahweh, about God, about the sacred scriptures, and about the history of humanity. We are about to delve into one of the greatest mysteries ever hidden by official history, a secret involving African cultures, black deities, historical rewritings, and a truth so impactful that it has been deliberately hidden for centuries. Did you know that before Yahweh was the God of Israel, there were African deities with surprisingly similar characteristics and names? That the very origin of the divine name may have much older roots than we have been taught? That there is archaeological evidence, ancient texts, and historical connections that have been systematically ignored or suppressed? The truth has been buried under layers of interpretations, biased translations, and convenient narratives. But today, at this very moment, you are about to gain access to information that will make you question absolutely everything. We are talking about impressive archaeological discoveries, connections between African civilizations and the Middle East that official history prefers to ignore, divine names that predate the Hebrew scriptures, and representations of gods that completely challenge the traditional narrative. This is not just another video about religion or history. This is a deep dive into concrete evidence, documented facts, and connections that have been purposefully erased. And you, who are here now, are part of a select group of people who will have access to this explosive truth. Because while millions continue to believe the official version, while most have never questioned where the name Yahweh really came from, while very few people know the true African origins of the religious traditions that shaped the world, you are about to discover what has been hidden. Let's begin this journey together, and I guarantee you'll never look at the Bible, the history of religions, or official narratives the same way again. Because what we're going to reveal here isn't empty conspiracy theories. It isn't unfounded speculation. We're talking about concrete archaeological evidence, verifiable historical documents, undeniable cultural connections that link African traditions to the roots of what we know today as Judaism and Christianity. And why is this so important to you? Because understanding the true origin of the beliefs that shaped Western civilization, that influenced billions of people, that defined wars, politics, entire cultures, is to understand the very foundation of our society. It's discovering that the history we were told was filtered, edited, manipulated to serve certain interests. It's realizing that African deities, black gods, the traditions of the continent that gave rise to humanity, were systematically erased from the official narrative. Throughout this video, you will discover specific names of African deities that predate Yahweh. You will learn about the archaeological evidence proving direct connections between Africa and the Middle East in periods much earlier than official history admits. You will understand why this information was hidden and who benefited from this concealment. But before we continue, I need to make a very important request. This video you are watching now took months of research, analysis of historical documents, study of archaeological evidence, and compilation of information that is scattered and often hidden in obscure corners of academia. If you want more people to have access to these truths, if you believe that knowledge should be shared, leave your comment now saying what you think so far. Comment anything. It can be just an emoji, it can be your opinion, it can be a word that summarizes what you are feeling at this moment. The algorithm needs to understand that this content is valuable, that people want to have access to this information. And of course, if you really want to delve deep into this truth, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning of a series of revelations that will completely transform your view on history, religion, and the origins of humanity. Let's begin our journey by going back in time, long before Moses, long before Abraham, long before the stories we know from the Bible. We're talking about a period when Africa was the pulsating center of human civilization, when great empires flourished on the African continent, when writing systems already existed, when astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and philosophy were already being developed by African peoples. And it is precisely in this context that we find the first manifestations of what would later be called monotheism. Contrary to everything we've been taught, the idea of a single supreme God did not originate in the desert of the Middle East. Archaeological and anthropological evidence points to much older African traditions that already worshipped unique and supreme deities. In ancient Egypt, for example, we have the concept of Aten, the solar disk, which Pharaoh Akhenaten attempted to establish as a single deity around 1350 BCE. But long before that, in regions of sub-Saharan Africa, there were already traditions that spoke of a supreme creator god, above all other spiritual beings. The Yoruba people, for example, worshipped Olodumare, the supreme god, creator of all things, eternal and omnipotent. Among the Akan people of present-day Ghana, there was Nyame, the god of the sky, supreme creator. The Zulus spoke of Unkulunkulu, the supreme ancestor and creator of everything. And here is something absolutely fascinating that most people are completely unaware of. Many of these African divine names share linguistic and conceptual roots with the name Yahweh. When we analyze the deep etymology, when we study the migrations of the Semitic peoples, when we examine the trade and cultural roots that connected Africa and the Middle East since time immemorial, we begin to realize something impressive. The name Yahweh, which in Hebrew is represented by the letters Yod, He, Vav, He, forming the sacred tetragrammaton, has an uncertain origin even for traditional scholars themselves. The official explanation states that it comes from the Hebrew verb to be, or to exist, resulting in something like the one who is, or I am who I am. But this is only one interpretation, and perhaps not the oldest. There is linguistic evidence that the name Yahweh may have roots in African languages much older than Hebrew. Some researchers have pointed to connections with Kushite, Ethiopian, and even Egyptian traditions. There is, for example, a striking similarity between Yahweh and certain divine names from the Nubian region, which corresponds to southern Egypt and northern Sudan today. The Nubians, black African peoples with a millennial civilization, had extremely sophisticated religious traditions, and some of their divine names present phonetic structures surprisingly similar to the Hebrew tetragrammaton. Even more intriguing is the connection with the region of Punt, mentioned in ancient Egyptian texts as the land of the gods, an African region from which incense, myrrh, gold, and sacred knowledge came. Punt is often associated with the region of present-day Somalia, Eritrea, or Ethiopia, all lands inhabited by black African peoples. And here comes something truly shocking. There are mentions in Egyptian texts of deities worshipped in Punt, who had characteristics extremely similar to those that would later be attributed to Yahweh. We are talking about a single creator god associated with fire, storms, the sacred mountain, and the desert. All these elements appear both in the African traditions of Punt and in later narratives about Yahweh. Coincidence? Too unlikely to be mere chance. Now let's look at the more concrete archaeological evidence. In excavations on the Sinai Peninsula, a region that is literally the bridge between Africa and Asia, Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions dating from approximately 1800 BCE were found. These inscriptions, made by Semitic workers operating in Egyptian mines, show a fascinating transition between Egyptian hieroglyphic writing and what would become the Semitic alphabet. And in these texts, there are references to deities that present hybrid characteristics between Egyptian gods and what would later be worshipped as Yahweh. Furthermore, there is evidence that Semitic groups lived in Egypt for extended periods, not only during the supposed Exodus, but in multiple migratory waves over centuries. These groups deeply absorbed Egyptian culture, which was an African culture, black in its essence, especially in the older dynasties. Moses himself, according to the biblical narrative, was raised in the Egyptian court, educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. Was the revelation of the divine name he received on Mount Sinai really something completely new? Or was it the rediscovery of a much older tradition with African roots that was being rescued and reinterpreted? Think about it. Mount Sinai is in Africa, on the peninsula that connects the African continent to Asia. The burning bush, the unconsuming fire, the sacred mountain shrouded in smoke and flames, the thundering divine voice. All these elements bear striking parallels to much earlier African religious traditions. In ancient Egypt, the sacred mountain was a central concept. The Benben, the primordial hill from which creation arose. Among East African peoples, mountains were seen as divine abodes, places where heaven and earth met. The very idea of a deity revealing itself through fire has deep roots in African traditions, where fire has always been seen as a purifying, transformative element, a channel of communication with the divine. Now we come to an absolutely surprising revelation that will make you rethink everything you know about the Bible and its origins. There is an ancient text, little known to the general public but extremely important to serious Bible scholars, that mentions something extraordinary about Yahweh. We are talking about inscriptions found in Kuntalet Ajrud and Khirbet el-Qom, dating from approximately the 8th century BCE. These inscriptions, discovered in the Sinai Desert near Hebron, contain blessings that mention Yahweh and his Asherah. That's right, Yahweh had a divine female consort, a goddess by his side, something that has been completely erased from the official biblical narrative we know today. And here's the shocking detail. Asherah was a Canaanite goddess, but her roots go back to much older African traditions. Canaan itself had populations with strong African influence, and the goddess Asherah shares characteristics with African female deities, especially those related to fertility, the earth, and creation. This shows us that the original worship of Yahweh was not the pure monotheism we know today, but rather a religion that included divine feminine elements, something common in African traditions, where the balance between masculine and feminine, between complementary principles, has always been fundamental. But this information was systematically suppressed. Later editors of the Bible, especially during and after the Babylonian exile, worked hard to erase any mention of Asherah, to eliminate references to other deities, to create a narrative of absolute monotheism that, in fact, did not exist in the earliest periods of Israel. And why does this matter? Because it shows us that the religion of Yahweh, in its most primitive origins, was much more connected to African traditions, which have always recognized the divine feminine principle, than to the purified and edited version that has reached us. Let's go even deeper. Does the name Yahweh appear in Egyptian texts? There are heated debates about this in academia, but there is intriguing evidence. Some Egyptian inscriptions mention the Shasu of Yahweh, referring to nomadic desert groups who worshipped a deity called Yahweh. And where did these Shasu live? In the region of Edom and Midian, areas south of Canaan, closer to Africa, in territories inhabited by peoples with a strong African component. Edom, in fact, means red in Hebrew, possibly referring to the darker skin color of its inhabitants. And Midian? It was where Moses fled from Egypt, where he married Zipporah, daughter of Jethro, the Midianite priest. Jethro was black, a descendant of Cushite peoples, Africans, and it was Jethro who taught Moses about justice, about how to organize the people, about leadership. Was it also Jethro who introduced or reintroduced Moses to the worship of Yahweh, a deity already known among these African and Proto-Arab desert peoples? Moses' own wife, Zipporah, was African. Moses' children had African blood. This is not speculation, it's in the Bible itself. And when Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses for marrying a Cushite woman, a black woman, they were punished by God. This story, recorded in the book of Numbers, shows us that there were racial tensions even in that period, but it also makes it clear that Yahweh himself defended Moses' union with a black African woman. Furthermore, Moses had two sons with Zipporah, Gershom and Eleazar, who were therefore half African, half Semitic. Moses' priestly lineage, those who were to preserve the teachings about Yahweh, had African blood running through their veins. This completely changes the narrative of racial purity that some have tried to impose throughout history. Let's now examine the physical characteristics attributed to Yahweh in the oldest biblical descriptions. In the book of Daniel, there is a vision of the Ancient of Days, a clear reference to God, described as having hair like pure wool. Wool is not straight, wool is curly, frizzy, like the hair of African peoples. In Revelation, the resurrected Jesus, in John's vision, is described as having hair like white wool and feet like polished bronze, refined in fire. Polished bronze darkened by fire is not a light rosy color, as in European representations, but rather a dark bronze tone, similar to the skin of the peoples of the Middle East and Africa. These descriptions were systematically ignored or reinterpreted over the centuries, especially when Christianity was adopted by the Roman Empire and then spread throughout Europe. European Christian iconography transformed all biblical figures into people of European appearance, white, with straight hair, light eyes, something that has absolutely no historical or geographical basis. The people who lived in Israel, Egypt, Ethiopia, throughout that region, were dark-skinned, with curly or wavy hair, with characteristics that today we would associate with Africans and Arabs, not Europeans. Now we're going to completely shatter an expectation you probably had and reveal something that will connect all of this to the world we live in today. Why isn't this information taught in schools? Why have most people never heard about the African roots of the worship of Yahweh? Why have the visual representations of God, of Jesus, of all biblical characters been whitewashed throughout history? The answer is disturbing but necessary. Because recognizing the African origins of Judaism and Christianity would completely challenge the power structures that were built on European supremacy and the marginalization of Africa. For centuries, slavery was justified using distorted interpretations of the Bible. The so-called curse of Ham was used to argue that black Africans were cursed by God and destined for servitude. This absurd and criminal interpretation completely ignored the fact that the biblical patriarchs themselves had deep connections to Africa, that Moses was married to a black African woman, and that the religion itself had roots in the African continent. If people knew that Yahweh, the God they worshipped, had originally been worshipped by African peoples, that the first manifestations of monotheism came from Africa, that the early Hebrews were indistinguishable in appearance from neighboring African peoples, the entire ideological structure that sustained slavery, colonialism, and racial segregation would collapse. And that is precisely why this information was suppressed. It was not an accident. It was not innocent forgetfulness. It was a deliberate choice to erase African contributions to human civilization, to rewrite history by placing Europe at the center of everything, to whitewash even religious figures who were, in fact, dark-skinned people. Today, in the 21st century, we are experiencing a moment of awakening. Modern archaeological tools, DNA analysis, advanced linguistic studies, all of this is bringing to light truths that have been buried. We now know, for example, that the ancient Egyptians, especially in the earliest dynasties, had far more sub-Saharan African DNA than previously thought. Examined mummies reveal characteristics that point to a much darker-skinned population than Hollywood portrayals have led us to believe. We know that there were trade and cultural routes connecting Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, the Arabian Peninsula, and Canaan since at least 3000 BCE. These connections were not sporadic. They were constant, intense, and transformative. Peoples, ideas, goods, and yes, religious concepts flowed continuously through these routes. The idea that Israel arose in isolation, without African influence, is simply untenable in light of modern evidence. And here's something that will make you think deeply about how you see the world today. How many other historical truths have been distorted? How many other contributions from non-European peoples have been erased? How much of what we learn in school is an edited, filtered, manipulated version of real history? Africa was not a continent of savages waiting to be civilized by Europeans. It was, and always has been, a continent of great civilizations, profound knowledge, and fundamental contributions to humanity. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, philosophy, medicine, metallurgy, all of this already existed in Africa when Europe was still in much more primitive stages of development. And yes, monotheism, the idea of a single, supreme God that would later become the basis of the three great Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, has deep African roots that have been systematically erased and denied. Imagine the impact of this. Billions of people around the world worship Yahweh, worship God, follow teachings that come from the Bible, but are completely unaware that the origins of these traditions are connected to Black Africa, the continent that was enslaved, colonized, marginalized, and systematically devalued for centuries. If this truth were widely known, if it were taught in schools, churches, mosques, and synagogues, how would that change the way we view racial issues today? How would that change perceptions of Africa and African peoples? How would that challenge the prejudices and stereotypes that still exist, even in the 21st century? Let's now delve into the concrete evidence that supports everything we're revealing here. There's a fascinating document called the Leiden Papyrus, which contains ancient Egyptian texts, including hymns to deities. One of these hymns is dedicated to Amun, the supreme god of Egypt during certain periods, and the similarities to the biblical psalms dedicated to Yahweh are striking, not only in poetic structure, but also in theological concepts. Both are described as creators of all things, as hidden gods whose true name is ineffable, as supreme beings above all other deities. Coincidence or direct cultural inheritance? Let's also consider the hymn to Aten, composed by Pharaoh Akhenaten, who reigned approximately between 1353 and 1335 BCE. This hymn, dedicated to the solar disk as the only true deity, presents remarkable parallels with Psalm 104 of the Bible. The similarities are so striking that many scholars, even the most conservative, admit that there must be some historical connection. Akhenaten was the pharaoh who attempted to establish monotheism in Egypt, abolishing the worship of multiple gods and concentrating worship solely on Aten. This attempt failed after his death, and Egypt returned to traditional polytheism, but the idea had been planted. And when did this happen? Exactly during the period when, according to some chronologies, the Hebrews were in Egypt or had just left it. Did Akhenaten's monotheistic experiment influence the Hebrews? Did Moses, educated in the Egyptian court, come into contact with these revolutionary ideas? Some scholars argue precisely this, that Hebrew monotheism has direct roots in Akhenaten's Egyptian monotheistic attempt, which was an African innovation from an African pharaoh. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, wrote a controversial book called Moses and Monotheism, where he argues precisely this, that Moses was Egyptian, not Hebrew, and that he introduced the Hebrews to the monotheism he had learned in Egypt during the time of Akhenaten. Although Freud's entire theory is debated and contested, the basic connection between Egyptian and Hebrew monotheism is increasingly accepted in academia. Let's now examine the deeper linguistic connections. Ancient Hebrew did not arise from nothing. It is a Semitic language related to Aramaic, Phoenician, Arabic, and all these languages have loanwords and influences from African languages, especially ancient Egyptian and Kushite languages. There are words in Hebrew that clearly come from Egyptian. For example, the Hebrew word for Nile, Yor, comes directly from Egyptian. The word for ark, Teva, used both for Noah's ark and for the basket where baby Moses was placed in the river, has Egyptian roots. There are dozens of other examples of Hebrew words that are loanwords from Egyptian, showing deep and prolonged cultural contact. And what about the name Yahweh specifically? There is a fascinating linguistic theory that connects the name to Kushite languages. Some researchers point to roots in Ethiopian and Eritrean languages, meaning to exist, to be, to live, fundamental concepts that align perfectly with the traditional explanation of Yahweh's meaning as I am. But the difference is that these African linguistic roots are potentially older than the Semitic ones, suggesting that the concept and perhaps even the name traveled from Africa to the Middle East, not the other way around. There are also intriguing connections with the name Yah, an abbreviated form of Yahweh frequently used in the Psalms and in Hebrew theophoric names such as Elijah, Eliyahu, Jeremiah, Yirmeyahu, Isaiah, Yeshayahu. This Yah appears in contexts that suggest a deity associated with the sky, thunder, and storms, just like many supreme African deities. The very concept of a celestial deity dwelling above in the heavens but descending in tempestuous manifestations is profoundly African and appears in numerous traditions across the continent. Now let's look at the material archaeology. Excavations in Timnah in southern Israel, near the border with Egypt, have uncovered traces of temples dedicated to Hathor, the Egyptian goddess, but which were later repurposed for Semitic cults. At these sites, there is evidence that Semitic groups working in the nearby copper mines adapted the Egyptian cult site for their own religious practices, demonstrating a direct cultural fusion. And when did this happen? Approximately between 1300 and 1200 BCE, precisely the period traditionally associated with the Exodus and the initial formation of Israel. The evidence shows that there was no clear and immediate separation between Egyptian and Hebrew religion, but rather a gradual process of differentiation where African and Egyptian elements were reinterpreted and adapted. Now we arrive at a point that many consider forbidden, controversial, deliberately hidden from official narratives because it challenges religious and academic power structures established centuries ago. Why has the Church, especially the Catholic Church and the major Protestant denominations that emerged in Europe, never emphasized these African connections? Why does traditional theological education rarely mention the Cushite roots of important biblical figures? Why does Christian iconography insist on representing biblical figures as white Europeans, when all historical, geographical, and archaeological evidence points to people with much darker skin? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary, because acknowledging these truths would mean admitting that Africa, the Black Continent, was fundamental to the development of the religion that became dominant in the Western world. It would mean admitting that for centuries, while enslaving Africans using distorted biblical justifications, Europeans were in fact practicing a religion whose roots were deeply intertwined with that very continent they dehumanized. The contradiction would be unbearable. How do you keep millions of people enslaved while simultaneously admitting that the very God you worship may have cultural and historical roots connected to the people you are oppressing? The solution was to erase, rewrite, whitewash. To transform Jesus from a Jewish man from the Middle East, who certainly had dark skin and curly hair, into a man of Nordic appearance. To transform Moses from a man educated in Africa, married to an African woman, influenced by African traditions, into a light-skinned patriarch totally disconnected from the Black Continent. To erase Asherah, the female consort of Yahweh, because her presence complicated the narrative of a pure, masculine monotheism. To omit that important biblical figures, such as the Ethiopian eunuch, the Queen of Sheba, and Moses' own wife, were Black Africans and played crucial roles in sacred history. And here's something that will shock many people. Recent genetic studies show that Jewish populations, especially groups like the Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, have direct genetic connections to ancient African populations. These Ethiopian Jews practice a very ancient form of Judaism, even predating the final redaction of the Talmud, preserving traditions that may represent more primitive forms of the religion. And they are Black, African, they always have been. For a long time, their Jewishness was questioned, they were discriminated against. They faced skepticism from Jews in other regions. But modern genetic testing has confirmed their ancestral connections to both Middle Eastern and African populations, exactly what we would expect if the ancient migrations and connections we are describing actually happened. The very existence of Black Jewish communities in Africa, not as a result of recent conversions but as direct descendants of ancient traditions, proves that history is far more complex and intertwined than the simplified narrative we have been taught. Consider also the Falashas, another name for Ethiopian Jews, who claim descent from the union between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Sheba was an African kingdom, likely located in the region of present-day Ethiopia and Yemen. The Queen of Sheba, called Makeda in Ethiopian tradition, was a powerful, wise Black woman who, according to biblical and Ethiopian narratives, had a son with Solomon named Menelik, who brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. This story, preserved in the Ethiopian text Kebra Nagast, directly connects the Ethiopian royal lineage with the lineage of David and Solomon, making the Ethiopian emperors, all Black Africans, direct descendants of the royal house of Israel. This is not fantasy or unfounded myth. There is historical evidence of deep connections between ancient Israel and African kingdoms, especially during the Solomonic period, which was known for its extensive trade with African regions, from where gold, frankincense, myrrh, ivory, and other precious products came. Now let's take a reflective pause and think together about what all this means for you, for your faith if you are religious, for your understanding of history if you are a scholar, for your worldview if you are simply seeking truth. When we discover that the narratives we have been taught have been filtered, edited, manipulated to serve specific agendas, how does this change our relationship with those narratives? If you are Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, does discovering that Yahweh, Allah, the Abrahamic God, has African roots change your faith? Should it? For some, it can be liberating, especially for Black people who have been taught to see their own culture and heritage as inferior, as primitive, as distant from the divine. Discovering that, in fact, their own African cultural roots are intertwined with the origins of the world's major religions can be profoundly empowering. It can transform shame into pride, alienation into belonging. For others, it can be unsettling, challenging, because it questions fundamental assumptions about racial purity, about cultural hierarchies, about who has the right to claim these sacred traditions as their own. And these questions are important. We need to ask them. We need to question why certain versions of history were privileged while others were suppressed. Who benefited from the erasure of African contributions? Who lost out? And what do we do with this information now? One thing is certain: ignorance is no longer an option. The evidence is there, in archaeological texts, in genetic analyses, in linguistic studies, in historical documents that have been preserved despite suppression efforts. We can no longer pretend that Africa was isolated, that its contributions to human civilization were minimal, that the religions that shaped the world arose without African influence. That would be deliberately closing our eyes to the truth. And what is your responsibility when you have access to this information? First, to question everything you have learned, not to accept official narratives simply because they are official. To seek primary sources, direct evidence, serious academic studies that have no ideological agenda, but seek historical truth. Second, to share. If you believe that knowledge should be accessible to all, that truth matters, then share this information. Converse with people, provoke reflection, challenge assumptions. Third, integrate. Allow these discoveries to transform your own worldview, your relationship with spirituality, your understanding of history and culture. Don't compartmentalize. Don't treat this as mere intellectual curiosity. Let this truth penetrate deeply and change something within you. And fourth, honor. Honor the African cultures and peoples who were systematically dehumanized, marginalized, exploited, but who, despite everything, preserved knowledge, traditions, and wisdom that are fundamental to understanding the very history of humanity. Recognize that Africa is not a continent of victims awaiting external salvation, but a cradle of civilization, knowledge, and profound spirituality that influenced everything, including the religions practiced by billions today. Let's now address how this knowledge, these revelations about the African roots of Yahweh and monotheism, can be applied to your real life, your daily life, your choices, your relationships, and how you see the world around you. First, this completely changes how you should approach racial issues. If you've discovered that the very God you may worship has origins connected to Africa, that central figures in Scripture were African or had deep connections to Africa, that wisdom and spiritual knowledge flowed from Africa to the rest of the world, then any notion of European racial superiority or African inferiority completely falls apart. Racism is not only morally wrong, it is historically ignorant and spiritually blind. You can no longer see black people, Africans, as inferior or primitive when you recognize that it was their ancestors who fundamentally contributed to the spiritual traditions that shaped civilization. Second, this should change how you consume and critique media and education. When you see a Hollywood film depicting Moses as a white man with blue eyes, you now know that this is a historical falsification. When you read a history book that minimizes or completely ignores African contributions, you recognize that you are reading propaganda, not true history. When you see religious art depicting Jesus, Mary, the apostles, all as Europeans, you understand that this is part of a deliberate process of whitewashing that served colonial and imperial purposes. Your cultural consumption becomes critical, questioning, no longer passive. Third, if you are an educator, a parent, someone who influences other people, especially young people, you now have a responsibility to transmit a more complete and honest version of history. It's not about completely discarding everything that has been taught, but about adding layers of complexity, about revealing connections that have been hidden, about giving credit where credit is due. Imagine the impact on a black child who learns from an early age that their African roots are connected to the most important spiritual traditions of humanity, that their ancestors were not primitive but rather bearers of profound knowledge. Imagine how this can transform self-esteem, sense of identity, and aspirations. Fourth, this can and should transform how you practice spirituality, if you are religious. It's not about abandoning your faith, but about enriching it with a deeper understanding of its roots. If you are Christian, recognizing the African origins of Christianity can bring you closer to African Christian traditions that preserved elements lost in European versions, such as the Coptic Church of Egypt and Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian denominations in the world, uninterrupted since the early centuries. If you are Jewish, recognizing the diversity of the Jewish people, including black African communities that have always been Jewish, enriches your understanding of what it means to be part of the chosen people. Fifth, in the political and social sphere, This knowledge should inform your positions on justice, reparations, and representation. If you understand that Africa was systematically exploited, its people enslaved, its contributions erased, all while its own spiritual traditions were being appropriated and whitewashed, then you can no longer be neutral or passive in the face of contemporary racial injustices. You have a moral responsibility to be part of the solution, to use your voice, your influence, your resources to correct historical imbalances. Sixth, this should transform how you travel, how you consume African cultural products, how you relate to people of African descent. With knowledge comes respect. When you recognize the depth of African civilization, when you understand that you are not doing charity or being condescending in valuing African culture, but rather recognizing real and fundamental contributions, the whole dynamic changes. You approach with humility, with a genuine desire to learn, not with paternalism or pity. Now let's connect all of this to spirituality, to philosophy, to the deeper meaning of why these revelations matter not only historically but existentially. When we recognize that Yahweh, the God who revealed himself to Moses, who freed the Hebrews from slavery, who established a covenant with a people, has roots that intertwine with ancestral African traditions. What does this tell us about the nature of the divine? It tells us that God, however you conceive of him, is not the property of any race, any continent, any specific culture. God transcends all these human categories. But at the same time, God reveals himself through specific cultures, in specific historical contexts, using languages and symbols that resonate with real people in real places. And Africa was one of those places, perhaps the most primordial of them, where humanity not only emerged biologically but also began to awaken spiritually, to ask the big questions about existence, purpose, the divine. African traditions have always recognized the fundamental unity of all existence, the interconnectedness between ancestors, the living and the unborn, the visible and the invisible, the material and the spiritual. This holistic thinking, this refusal to artificially separate body and spirit, nature and divinity, individual and community, is deeply rooted in African philosophies and can be traced through the religious traditions that emerged from the continent. Ubuntu, a South African concept that can be translated as I am because we are, expresses a worldview where individual identity is inseparable from community belonging, where humanity is something that is realized in relationship, not in isolation. This ancestral African wisdom offers a powerful antidote to the alienating individualism that dominates many modern societies. When you understand that even your relationship with the divine, if you follow Abrahamic traditions, is rooted in a worldview that valued community, interconnectedness, and balance between complementarities, you can begin to question modern assumptions about religion as a purely individual experience, about salvation as a solitary destiny, about faith disconnected from social and community responsibility. African traditions have never separated religion from daily life, spirituality from practical ethics, worship from social justice. These characteristics are also present in biblical prophecy, where prophets like Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah denounced social injustice, the oppression of the poor, and empty worship disconnected from ethical practice. Is this a coincidence or an inheritance from an African worldview that has always seen religion and justice as inseparable? Consider also the concept of Mat, an ancient Egyptian principle of truth, justice, order, balance, and harmony. Mat was simultaneously a goddess and a cosmic principle, something that should be practiced by both pharaohs and ordinary people. The Egyptian Book of the Dead contains negative confessions, where the soul declares that it has not committed various sins, has not stolen, has not killed, and has not caused suffering. Does this sound familiar? The Ten Commandments follow a similar structure, establishing fundamental ethical prohibitions. The similarity is remarkable and suggests direct influence, or at least a shared cultural context. Regarding the spiritual principles you can incorporate into your life, regardless of your religion or lack thereof, African traditions offer profound wisdom about respecting ancestors, honoring those who came before, recognizing that you are a link in a chain that extends to the past and the future. This ancestral respect is not the worship of the dead, but the recognition that your existence is possible because of the sacrifices, struggles, and wisdom of previous generations. You have a responsibility to honor this heritage and pass it on enriched to future generations. Another principle is the recognition of the sacred in all of nature. African traditions saw trees, rivers, mountains, and animals as manifestations of the divine, not as mere resources to be exploited. This spiritualized ecological vision is urgently needed in our era of climate crisis, where disconnection between humanity and nature is literally threatening planetary survival. When you recognize that ancient spiritual traditions, including those that influenced Abrahamic monotheism, had this reverence for nature, you find a spiritual foundation for environmental activism, for living more sustainably, for reconnecting with the earth. Now let's delve even deeper, questioning not only what you know, but how you know it, not only what you believe, but why you believe it. How many of your beliefs about religion, history, race, and Africa were formed by sources you never questioned? How many times have you simply accepted what you were taught in school, church, or on television without seeking primary sources, without examining evidence, without asking who benefits from a particular narrative? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine invitations to self-examination. We live in an age of abundant information, but also of massive misinformation. It has never been so easy to access knowledge, and it has also never been so easy to be manipulated by false narratives. So how do you discern truth? First, by seeking multiple sources, especially sources that come from different perspectives. If you only read history written by Europeans about Africa, you are receiving a filtered, biased version. Seek out African historians, African archaeologists, African theologians who are doing the work of recovering and retelling their own stories. Second, examine primary evidence whenever possible. Read carefully translated ancient texts, look at images of archaeological artifacts, study maps of ancient trade routes, examine genetic data from populations. Don't rely solely on third-party interpretations. Go to the sources. Third, be willing to change your mind when confronted with better evidence. This requires intellectual humility, a willingness to admit you were wrong, and the courage to abandon comfortable beliefs when they don't hold up under scrutiny. It's difficult, but necessary if you truly value truth over comfort. Fourth, always ask, who benefits? When a historical or religious narrative is promoted, who gains power, prestige, and resources from that version of events? When African contributions are erased from the history of monotheism, who benefits? When biblical figures are whitewashed in art and popular imagination, who wins? These questions reveal the power dynamics behind the production of knowledge. Now think about the existential significance of these discoveries. If you have discovered that God is not the exclusive property of any one culture, that the divine has revealed and continues to reveal itself through multiple peoples, cultures, and continents, what does this mean for your own spiritual journey? It means you have the freedom to seek wisdom wherever it is found, to honor truth wherever it appears, to recognize the sacred in diverse traditions without feeling unfaithful to your own. It means that religious exclusivism, the idea that only one tradition holds all the truth and all others are completely wrong, is untenable. It is not necessary to embrace total relativism where everything is equally true, but it is possible and necessary to recognize that different traditions capture different aspects of divine reality, that none holds a monopoly on truth. For you personally, this may mean enriching your spiritual practice by learning from traditions you previously ignored or despised. It may mean recognizing African elements in your own religious tradition if you are Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, and valuing those roots instead of denying them. It can mean developing genuine solidarity with African peoples, recognizing the spiritual and cultural debt that Western civilization owes to Africa, a debt that was denied while the continent was exploited and its peoples dehumanized. Let's now explore the practical application of all this, how you can truly integrate this knowledge into concrete choices, specific actions, and real changes in the way you live. First, in the realm of education, if you have children or work in education, you can begin to introduce more complete narratives about religious history, about African civilizations, about the contributions of the African continent to humanity. This doesn't mean inventing or exaggerating. It simply means telling the complete story that has been omitted. There are excellent resources, children's books on African history, educational materials developed by African scholars, documentaries that show the archaeology and history of the continent with academic rigor and without colonial biases. Use these resources. Expose children to images of a Black Jesus, of Moses with African features, of saints and religious figures represented with the racial diversity that truly existed. This is not imposing a political agenda. It is correcting historical distortions. Second, in the realm of cultural consumption, support African and Afro-descendant artists, writers, and filmmakers who are telling their own stories, reclaiming their own narratives, and creating art that reflects their experiences and wisdom. When you watch an African film, read a book by an African author, listen to African music, you are directly challenging centuries of cultural marginalization. You are saying with your choices that African voices matter, that African stories deserve to be heard. Third, in the religious sphere, if you are part of a faith community, you can provoke conversations about race, about history, about the African origins of the traditions you practice. This will be uncomfortable for many. There will be resistance, but it is necessary. Suggest that your church, synagogue, or mosque invite African or Afro-descendant speakers to talk about biblical history from African perspectives, that it organize study groups on African contributions to faith, that it reevaluate the iconography used to represent sacred figures. These changes will not happen overnight, but they begin with courageous people willing to raise difficult questions. Fourth, in the political and social sphere, use your vote, your voice, your influence to support policies that promote racial justice, that combat structural inequalities, that recognize and attempt to repair historical damage caused by slavery, colonialism, and systemic racism. If you understand that Africa was systematically exploited while its contributions were erased, you cannot be neutral on contemporary issues of racial justice. Neutrality is complicity. Fifth, on a personal and relational level, examine your own biases, your internalized stereotypes about Black people, about Africa, about cultures different from your own. This requires brutal honesty with yourself. We have all been conditioned by a society that hierarchizes races, that treats whiteness as the standard and everything else as a deviation. Recognizing this conditioning is the first step to deconstructing it. Seek genuine relationships with people different from you, not as a charity project, but as a recognition of shared humanity and respect for differences. Listen more than you speak. Learn more than you teach. Recognize that you have much to learn from people whose experiences and perspectives have been historically marginalized. We have now reached the final stretch of this journey, and I need to recap some of the most important revelations we have shared, because what you have discovered today is not just abstract academic information. It is knowledge that can and should transform how you see the world, how you practice your faith if you are religious, how you relate to issues of race and justice, and how you understand the very history of humanity. First, we discovered that Yahweh, the sacred name of the God of Israel, has deep connections with ancestral African traditions, that the worship of the one God did not arise in isolation in the desert of the Middle East, but was influenced by monotheistic concepts that already existed in Africa, particularly in Egypt and Ethiopia. Second, we saw that central figures in the Hebrew scriptures had direct connections with Africa, that Moses was raised in African Egypt, married a Black African woman, was instructed by an African father-in-law, and that his own children were Afro-Semites, mixed-race individuals who carried the blood of both Semitic and African peoples. Third, we examined archaeological, linguistic, and genetic evidence showing intense and constant cultural exchanges between Africa and the Middle East since very ancient times, proving that there was no isolation, but rather a continuous flow of people, ideas, goods, and yes, religious concepts. Fourth, we uncovered how these truths were systematically suppressed, erased, and distorted to serve colonial and racist agendas, how religious iconography was deliberately whitewashed, how African contributions were minimized or denied, and how narratives were edited to place Europe at the center and Africa on the margins. Fifth, we reflected on the profound meaning of these discoveries, on how they challenge notions of racial superiority, and on how recognizing the African roots of monotheism should transform our relationship with racial justice, spirituality, education, cultural consumption, and political activism. And now, what do you do with all this? Do you simply absorb it as an interesting curiosity and continue your life unchanged? Or do you allow this truth to penetrate deeply, disturb, challenge, and transform you? My invitation to you, who have made it this far, who have invested your precious time listening to these revelations, is to choose transformation. Choose to question official narratives, seek diverse sources, examine evidence, and think critically. Choose to honor African contributions to human civilization, to recognize the cultural and spiritual debt we all owe to the continent that is the cradle of humanity. Choose to combat racism not only in its explicit and violent forms, but also in its subtle manifestations, such as historical erasure, cultural whitening, and the marginalization of non-European voices. If you are religious, choose to enrich your faith by exploring your African roots, learning from traditions that have been suppressed, integrating wisdom from multiple sources without feeling that you are betraying your own tradition. If you are not religious, choose to value honest historical knowledge, to recognize that understanding the past is essential to navigating the present and building a more just future. And now my specific request to you who have actually made it to the end of this video: show that you are here. Leave your comment writing African, just that word, so that I know how many people actually watched until the end and were impacted by these revelations. Leave a like, because this content took months of research, evidence compilation, and careful structuring to bring you quality information that you won't easily find elsewhere. Subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning. We have much more to reveal about hidden stories, suppressed truths, and knowledge that can transform your worldview. And watch the next video that's appearing on your screen now, because we will continue to unravel mysteries, reveal truths, question official narratives, and always seek genuine knowledge based on evidence, not ideological agendas. You are now part of a select group of people who have access to information that most are unaware of, who question instead of simply accepting, who value truth above comfort. Use this knowledge wisely, share it responsibly, allow it to transform you, and through you, transform others. Together, we are recovering stories that have been erased, honoring marginalized peoples, and building a more complete and honest understanding of our shared history as humanity.